Topic notes: cartilaginous fish, or class Chondrichthyes. So this is a picture of a yellow stingray that I took here locally in Florida. We are going to be talking all about sharks and rays during this particular note set. So let's get started. First up, the main ideas. Fish have evolved adaptations to a wide variety of habitats and play key ecological roles within the ocean. Once again, make sure to reference back to your learning goals as you study. So we'll start off with the basic characteristics of class Chondrichthyes. Now, if you notice, I'm not going to get into very specific detail about taxonomy and classification here. We're obviously in the vertebrates, subphylum Vertebrata, and we're going to be looking at class Chondrichthyes. Now, if you break Chondrichthyes down, the Greek chondros means cartilage, and ichthyos is fish, and of course the study of ichthyology is the study of fish, so just keep note of that. So if you break those two together, it makes pretty good sense what the name means. Now, if you're not familiar with what cartilage is, if you just reach up there and kind of wiggle your ear, the stuff that's inside holding your ear up and making that particular form, that's cartilage. And cartilage is a little bit lighter weight, obviously, than bone, and it's more flexible. Interestingly enough, sharks specifically have what we call calcified cartilage, and basically it's where you have little grains of calcium actually embedded within the cartilage itself, making it a little bit stronger in some certain targeted places in the body. Now, we're obviously dealing with jaw fish. We talked about jawless fish in the previous set notes, but these obviously do have jaws. They have paired fins and paired nostrils, which come up a little later, and they do not have swim bladders, so they have to use other methods to maintain buoyancy. By far, the majority of sharks and rays are carnivores and scavengers, and also from an ecological perspective, which is important, they generally have a small number of offspring, which is very typical of organisms and animals that are higher up on the trophic level. Now, I'm going to talk very briefly about shark evolution, and I say this because there's still a lot of studies going on about this. The first sharks, or kind of the ancestral version of sharks, appeared somewhere more than 400 million years ago. Now, we really have a hard time pinpointing this because cartilaginous skeletons don't really leave fossils. They tend to deteriorate pretty rapidly. So generally, fossil evidence for sharks tends to be limited to teeth and impressions of scales and harder tissues. This has all in all left sharks a bit of a mystery. We have a ton of teeth, obviously, because sharks, if you may or may not know, pretty much replace their teeth constantly. So we have an ocean full of teeth kind of out there to look at. But beyond that, it gets a little limiting. In fact, for quite a long time, sharks were sort of looked at as more of a primitive state of a fish than more of a developed or evolved fish. But new studies are starting to shed some light on this. So in 2015, a study was published about a 380 million year old fossil shark from Western Australia. Its scientific name was shortened using the term go-go shark, and you see some of the fossils there on the right. The bottom image is after 3 weeks in a dilute acetic acid preparation, which allows the lower jaw to actually be seen in more of a 3D fashion. The animated model on the left, on the top, shows where some of these bones would have fit into the actual shark itself, and of course some of the shark teeth there below it. They examined fossil fragments using a micro-CT scanning technique, and what they found was that the matrix that holding these fossils together was definitely reminiscent of modern cartilage, but they retained the cellular structure of remnant bone cells. That was very interesting. This all starts to support the idea that sharks must have evolved from a bony primitive ancestor and lost their bones early on as they started to adapt to becoming a predator, meaning that they wanted to increase their speed and their flexibility and their ability to capture prey. So either way, stay tuned because this is an evolving story and we're going to learn more about this in the coming years. So let's jump back into the modern era, and we'll start talking about skates and rays. So skates and rays in general, and again, I'm going to sort of gloss over sort of the taxonomy and classification right now, but generally their characteristics support a flattened disc-like body and enlarged pectoral fins that are fused to the head. So basically it gives them that kind of continuous look, if you will, instead of separate pectoral fins. Now we can break things up into groups, and I'm just going to use some common names here to group things. We have stingrays and their relatives. Now this includes species that give live birth. They're viviparous, if you go back to your vocabulary. Stingrays specifically have sharp venomous barbs on the tail, but others within their group, like manta rays, do not. And manta rays, of course, feed on plankton, and they do lack those barbs. Now we have two other groups. We have the skates, and skates generally lay eggs, so they're oviparous. They lack those big barbs that the stingrays have, but they do have these little short projections that are a little bit sharp, and they tend to have shorter tails. Then we have the sawfish, and you would think sawfish would be grouped more with sharks, and there's some taxonomic debates going on, but generally they tend to be grouped with rays and skates. They have that shark-like form, and they have that long, flat snout with the teeth projecting from that. They can actually use that to slash and impale fish, and then thus be able to consume them more easily. So sawfish are incredibly awesome fish, and unfortunately, they are among the most endangered out there. So they are on our endangered species list. Now we're going to move into the sharks themselves, and they are incredibly diverse. Again, there are more than 400 species of sharks known, and in fact, I look up different numbers all the time. There could be upwards of 500 or more. Kind of depends on what source you're looking at. But either way, there's a lot of them, and they range in size from just a few inches, like this little horn shark, all on the right, all the way to the large whale shark, which can be up to 60 feet. Now remember, these 60-foot whale sharks, guess what they eat? That's right, plankton. They eat the smaller things in the ocean. They don't even have really teeth to work with. So we're going to start by going through external anatomy, and we're going to begin with camouflage. Now, one of the concepts that you'll often see associated with sharks is countershading. This is where your dorsal surface is darker and the ventral surface is lighter. And if you've ever kind of think of any image of a shark you might have seen in what's embedded in your head, you probably would come up with that without thinking about it, because it's the classic shark look. And it's very specific and targeted, because if you are looking down from above the water, the shark with that dark dorsal surface is going to blend into the deeper water below. Similarly, if you're under the shark looking up, the white belly is going to blend into the lighter surface. This allows the shark to be very stealthy, sneaking up on its prey items. Now, of course, not all sharks do this. We have bottom-dwelling sharks, like this angel shark on the bottom right there, that are very much colored to match the sea floor. Locally, we have the nurse shark, for example, that's all kind of a sandpaper brown, which matches a lot of the sea floor. So camouflage is key in all shark species, and they do it differently depending on their habitat. Now, if we look at the overall shape of sharks, there is some definite diversity here. Obviously, we just saw the picture of an angel shark, which is more flattened. But if we look at the classic general shark shape, especially the pelagic open water swimming sharks, they tend to be fusiform. Remember, when we talked about fusiform body shapes, they are very energy efficient for getting through the water very quickly. Of course, that efficiency is very important to a predator which wants to conserve as much energy as possible as it's setting up its next meal. All of the shark's fins work together to help keep the shark going. Obviously, you have the caudal fin, which provides that forward motion. Now, if you notice, some sharks have a much larger upper lobe to that caudal back fin than the lower lobe. There's a good reason for that. The longer and thicker upper lobe as the shark swims helps provide downward thrust. This is part of compensating for buoyancy and keeping the shark up in the water column. These types of tails are even more exaggerated in something like a thresher shark, which is a slow-moving shark in the open ocean. So it needs a really long upper lobe of that tail to help keep it up. Whereas this short fin mako, the two lobes are relatively similar, with the upper lobe just being a little bigger than the lower lobe. But makos are the speed demons of the shark world. They move the fastest out of just about any fish. The faster you move, the less downward force you need to stay up in the water column. Now, the thresher shark has one of the longest upper lobes of any of the shark species, but they actually have adapted it to something other than just helping them keep buoyancy control. They use their long tail as a whip-like tool to knock fish out so they can access them for food more easily. This really demonstrates how two different sort of selective pressures can actually influence the same adaptive trait. The rest of the fins are used for various degrees of stability and steering. Pectoral fins, for example, provide a lot of steering. Pelvic and dorsal fins tend to provide a lot of stability. Now, sharks are not covered with typical scales that you would see in fish. They're actually placoid scales. They're called dermal denticles. And in reality, they're homologous to teeth. In fact, they really are more closely related to teeth than they are of scales. They actually have enamel on them. What's also interesting about them, other than the fact that they make the skin very tough and very kind of protective for the shark, they're also pointed towards the tail to reduce drag. This is one of the reasons that if you ever touch a shark, if you want to, you need to touch it from the head towards the tail. If you try and rub it from the tail upwards, you'll feel the rough nature of those dermal denticles fighting against you. Speaking of teeth, of course, sharks are known for having multiple rows of front teeth. That means as their teeth sort of break off or wear down, new teeth actually come up to replace the old damaged ones. Now, the shape of the tooth really depends on what kind of food the shark is eating. If you see the shark there on the left, you'll see very kind of slender, pointy teeth of the sand tiger. These teeth are really meant for grabbing and swallowing. Now, if you also look at the teeth sort of in the middle, in the background there, those really large ones, those are Carcharodon megalodon teeth. Those are fossilized teeth of the ancient giant great white shark. Now, that distinctive sort of triangular conical sort of shape is good for kind of ripping into things. And even more so than that, if you look at the tooth embedded in that picture, it's got multiple angles on it. That is the tooth of a tiger shark. Tiger sharks are known for grabbing things and ripping chunks of flesh off, and so they have those serrated edges. So again, it depends on what the shark is going for and what type of prey depends on the type of meal. There are some sharks that even have teeth that are modified more for cracking open exoskeletons for invertebrates and stuff, especially some of the smaller little sharks. Now, sharks in general have some modifications for digestion that really helps them in their particular environment. First of all, their stomach tends to be very expandable. That allows them to intake larger food items than would normally be consumed based on body size. They don't want to turn down a meal if one presents itself to them, basically. And of course, their stomach has strong acids to try and help break those things down quite quickly. Now, some of the larger sharks, especially larger predators like white sharks and makos, they tend to have a higher body temperature, kind of like an endotherm, where they maintain that higher temperature compared to the water. And this allows them to digest food more quickly. Another adaptation are the intestines. Inside the intestines, they have what we call a spiral valve, which really is just a series of tissue flaps within the intestine that kind of allow food to spiral down as it gets absorbed and the nutrients are brought into the bloodstream. So this allows a lot of surface area for that nutrient absorption, which is increasing the efficiency even though the intestines take up a smaller space. Now, very similarly, when we talked about respiration in fish, or bony fish, same sort of things apply here. Sharks have gills, between 5 to 7 gills, depending on the species. They do not have gill covers, however, like bony fish do. Now, some sharks do have spiracles. Spiracles are vestigial first gill slits, and they generally are absent in the more pelagic open water swimming sharks. Those sharks tend to rely on ram ventilation, which is why their mouths are open a lot, whereas bottom-dwelling sharks, like the nurse shark or even skates and rays, will often have that spiracle opening to help them flush water in and then out through their gills. Now we'll talk a little bit about buoyancy control, and we've already mentioned the heterocircle tail that maintains lift, but it's that large oily liver that's the big deal. So sharks have a gigantic liver compared to other species in similar body sizes, and it's filled with oil. And if you ever pour oil into water, you'll know that the oil floats towards the top. It's more buoyant because the oil is less dense than the surrounding water. The same concept applies to the sharks. So if they have a good quantity of oil, that helps them reduce their density in the water and helps them increase their buoyancy. Now the picture below, the one and sort of the bottom middle, shows a few fishermen standing inside of a whale shark. And although it's sort of disturbing on one end, it gives you an idea of just how big the livers are because you have several people standing around it. On the picture on the right shows a liver out of a dissected dogfish, so it's a little bit more traditional of a cut, but you can still again see just all those huge lobes and long lobes of livers coming out of there. In terms of reproduction, we always have to look at the ecological role various species play within the environment. Now, sharks tend to be your top trophic level predators. Now, there's exceptions for this, especially some of your smaller sharks that access kind of crustaceans and things like that. But if we kind of put those out of the picture and just think of the larger predatory sharks, they're up there. And in doing so, they tend to have a very slow growth rate, and they experience sexual maturity late in life as well. They have low fertility, and they have long lifespans. What all this means is that they are very slow to replace themselves. That means their populations grow relatively slowly. This has huge impacts, of course, for us because if you have a top predator that grows too fast, their population grows too fast, they're going to overshoot that carrying capacity. Remember what we talked about back in first quarter. They're going to overshoot that carrying capacity, and they're going to crash their whole population. So predators need to be able to scale up according to their prey items and their resources around them, and of course scale back down based on the lack of that prey item around them. If their reproductive potential was too high, it would be very difficult to do that. But on the flip side of things, really what ends up happening, of course, when humans get involved and we start taking out large numbers of these predators, they're not able to rebuild their population quickly. And that is why we have so many species that are threatened or endangered. Now, as for the actual reproductive process itself, we generally have internal fertilization, and they do this by inserting what we call a clasper. The males have these claspers. You can see them labeled there in the top picture. And those claspers deploy the sperm into the females. Now, shark mating can be a little rough with the male grabbing onto the female with their mouth. But there's quite a lot about shark reproduction that we really don't know. There's only a few coastal species and those that we've had in captive environments that we're able to really talk about. When you talk about things like great white sharks or makos or whale sharks, we are really still just scratching the surface of what we know. So let's look at some of the different strategies. A few species are oviparous, which means they lay eggs, and also a few are viviparous, meaning that they give live birth. Most are oviviparous, which means the eggs develop inside the mother, and eventually hatch inside the oviduct as well. Now, the interesting part about this is there could be up to about 50 different eggs, and as they hatch, basically the baby shark that gets the largest, up to about 4 inches or so first, will start to cannibalize all its brothers and sisters. And so you end up with only maybe 2 or 3 actual pups that actually pop out of the mother and become fully developed sharks swimming off into the deep blue. And yes, by the way, no shark mom and dads here. Once those little babies are born and into the water, they are perfectly designed eating machines. They do not need any parenting. They do not need any protection. They just go off into the blue as their own right then and there. There are also some very rare instances of asexual reproduction, but we are really starting to study that, so we've got a long way to go. Now we're going to talk about shark senses and really try and understand how incredibly well adapted they are to access their prey. We'll start with hearing. Sharks don't have external ears, but they do have inner ears, and they can hear low-frequency sounds from kilometers away, up to almost a mile. And these low-frequency sounds are typically made by distressed animals. Remember, sharks are predators. They are not going to spend any more energy than they have to get the food they need. So they want to go after things that are not healthy, that are weak, that are swimming slowly or erratically. That's going to draw their attention. So once they hear something, they're going to start going after it. Then they're going to start looking for something that smells, and they're going to use their nasal passages, or nares. And on the picture on the bottom left here, you'll see the 2 nares on either side of the shark's head. They can actually smell in 3D. They can tell the direction of the smell and the scent, and they can smell 1 drop of blood and 1,000,000 drops of water. So once they're starting to hone in using hearing, they'll start to pick up the smell in the water, and that helps them zero things in a little bit more specifically. As they get closer, they're going to start using the lateral line. Now, the lateral line, just like in bony fish, senses vibrations or pressure changes in the water, and that could be again from that fish. They again continue to hear it, they continue to start to smell it, and they start to sense its vibrations. Next up is vision. As they start to zero in, they're going to look for it. And sharks have a well-developed ability to see. They're very sensitive in low light conditions. They don't see color so well. In fact, even though they do have a mixture of rods and cones, if you remember how vision works, cones are what we use to see color, but they generally only have one type of cone, so they don't tend to see that spectrum. But they can pick up contrasts really well as well. So either way, they will start to narrow in by trying to get their sights on their prey item. Now, a little bit of an aside here, sharks actually have what we call a nictitating membrane that comes up over their eye during feeding. Now, this happens when the shark is actually biting down onto their prey item. They do this for protection, because obviously anything that they're trying to consume might be fighting back, and they want to protect their eyes from any of that action. Now, even though sharks can see well, they do not rely on their vision completely. In fact, they can do very well in low visibility conditions using this next sense, electroperception. How this works is they use a series of jelly-filled canals called the ambula of Lorenzini, and those canals are able to pick up the sensitive electrical signals sent out by any animal that's moving. In fact, every time you move your arms or legs or anything, you're producing kinetic energy within your muscles. Sharks can sense this, and they can use that to find their prey items even when their eyes don't work so well. Electroperception really is a close range sense, but that is also added to by taste. Now, sharks have a very highly developed sense of taste. They can sense the energy content of prey items. they will tend to go after prey items that tend to have more energy content in them, especially fatty sort of, organisms. So if you put all of this together, this gives you a map of shark senses and when they're used in the prey acquisition process. You're going to start with that hearing. You're going to start to pick up the smell. Then they're going to use their lateral lines to pick up the vibrations. They're going to try and get visual sights on the prey item. And then as they close in, they're going to use electroperception and, of course, taste. Now, it's really important to put this in perspective because sharks are very good at accessing their food, their prey items. They're also incredibly important to the ecosystem at large just because of that. Sharks and other large predators generally keep ecosystems in balance, and they also keep other species healthier. This happens because they pick out the less healthy, diseased, or weak organisms within the population, so those genes don't get spread on, making a lot of times the animals that the sharks are actually preying upon healthier overall in terms of the population. So they're really, really critical in the environment, just like every other predator. Now it's time to throw it back to you. Here's your in-depth question. People are typically afraid of sharks. I don't think that's any mystery. But what role does fear play in the ability of local and international efforts to conserve sharks? Now, normally this would be the end of the video. However, I am going to add a few more slides and talk about something that most of you might be a little interested in, and that's shark attacks. And this sort of relates to this in-depth question, so you might want to hang on for a few more minutes. Now, first of all the statistics that I'm going to go over are coming off of the shark attack files, which is kept by the Florida Museum of Natural History. So what we're showing you here is the number of confirmed unprovoked shark attacks from 1580 to present day. Now, when we say unprovoked, we're basically talking about the fact that the shark bites a human, doesn't necessarily kill, we're not talking about fatalities yet, but it bites a human, and that human was not doing anything specifically to the shark. For example, if you were fishing and you were reeling in the shark and in that process you got bit, that would be considered a provoked attack, if you will. So that's the distinguishing feature between that. Now, if you look at the top countries, the United States wins in overall shark bites or unprovoked shark attacks throughout pretty much all of recorded history. 1,407 as of today in the beginning of 2018. Now you notice there's a big lag between the first and the second place winner here, which is Australia with 621 unprovoked shark attacks and South Africa with 252. And of course the numbers go down decreasingly from there, Brazil and New Zealand tagged on there. So now let's just focus on the United States. And of course, if you break it down over recorded history, our top states for shark attacks, of course, we are number one, Florida, 812 over the course of recorded history. Hawaii being 159, California 122, but let's just face it, globally, Florida is the shark attack capital of the world. Now, doesn't that make you want to go out in the water and swim? Hopefully, after we get done talking about this, you'll understand that even here in Florida, being attacked or even killed by a shark is extremely rare. Based on the U.S. Census Bureau, 58.64 million people went to the beach in 2010 in the U.S. Okay, think about that, 58.6 million. All right. Now, what I'm showing you here is all the shark attacks in all of recorded history. Florida only has 812, but 1,400 or so total. Still, considering that 58 million in 1 year, we haven't even come close to that number in all of recorded history in terms of actual shark attacks. What this means is that sharks have such a highly developed sensory system to access prey items that they actively avoid humans most of the time, and they're pretty successful at it. Let me repeat. Humans, are not on the diet list of any shark. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't get into the wrong place at the wrong time and get bitten. It does happen, but the statistics are on our side. We definitely have less of a chance than you would think. Now let's take a look at Florida specifically. So the top counties are Volusia with 299 attacks, Brevard with 144, and Palm Beach County with 75. So we're not the top in Palm Beach County, but we're pretty close. But again, I have to remind you, these are unprovoked shark attacks, not fatalities. In fact, so if you look at unprovoked non-fatal attacks in Florida, you have 812, but fatal, when people actually died, attacks where people actually died, is only 36 in all of recorded history in Florida. Think of how many people are at the beach in the water, diving, snorkeling, surfing every year. And over all of those years, we only have 36 recorded fatalities. That is very, very small. The reason for this is that most bites tend to be the case of mistaken identity, where the shark actually is going after prey items in murky, rough water and tend to hit a human along the way. Generally, this tends to be surfers, and we'll get back to that in a minute. So let's put some things in perspective here. Looking at some statistics, your risk of dying during your lifetime due to a shark attack is 1 in 3,740,067. It's a huge number. You can break that down from like heart disease. 1 in 5 chance of dying due to heart disease, 1 in 7 due to cancer, 1 in 13,729 just from sun and heat exposure. None of them even get close to the odds that are so slim for a shark attack. Now, if you rate this based on activities in the water, the highest percent chance is from surfing and board sports, about 59%, and swimming and wading, about 22%. Generally, when you're snorkeling, freediving, or scuba diving, your chances are much lower because you're in a clear environment simply because you want to see, and sharks usually know what you are and they tend to avoid you. So the next couple of graphs show you on the left here the breakdown of the different species involved in shark attacks here in Florida. Blacktips, spinner sharks, and bull sharks tend to make up the majority. And that makes sense because those are a lot of the shark species that tend to be running bait near shore, especially during the times of year where you have rough water and murky conditions, especially up in Brevard and Volusia County. And you also have a lot of surfers out in those waters as well, simply because, well, Florida doesn't have great waves all the time, and that's one of the times we have good waves. What's somewhat disturbing, and I'll come back to in a little bit, is that nurse sharks make up about 7% of the bites. And you would say, how could possibly a nurse shark actually attack people? Well, we're going to get back to that in a minute, so hold that thought. Now, the pie charts to the right show these are actually white shark victims, but it gives you an idea in terms of age bracket. And as you might expect, the majority of victims tend to be in their 20s and 30s. More interesting is the graph on the bottom there, which shows the breakdown of gender in terms of the number of attacks, with the vast majority being male and a very small percentage being female. You can make whatever guesses and speculations you want from there. But let's talk about risk management. How do we reduce our risk of being attacked by a shark in the water? Well, here's the first thing. Always swim in a group. Never swim alone. And there's a lot of reasons for this. Even the most highly trained swimmer in the world can easily drown without somebody being around. It only takes a second to get a cramp and accidentally suck in some water, and then all of a sudden you're drowning. So if you have a buddy with you, that buddy can help you or even go and get help if needed. When it comes to sharks, again, larger groups of people, you may actually also intimidate the shark. Sharks are actually relatively afraid of things. You also want to avoid being in the water during darkness or in twilight hours, sunset, sunrise. That's when a lot of fish are kind of changing shifts, moving around, and sharks are taking advantage of that. And they have sensory systems that could be somewhat compromised during those times as well. And of course, this might seem obvious. You probably shouldn't go in the water if you're bleeding, because of course that's going to attract attention by many predators. It's often recommended that you don't bring shiny jewelry into the water as well. Really, shiny jewelry kind of can glitter around and kind of draw interest. There's not a lot of statistical data showing that that increases your chances of being attacked by a shark, but it could increase your chances of maybe a barracuda following you a little closely, trying to figure out what's going on around your neck. Generally speaking, you don't want to draw attention to yourself in these ways. Again, another obvious one, but you probably want to avoid areas with known effluents that are used by fishermen, for example, if they're throwing carcasses out in the water, things like that. Again, blood in the water or any sort of active smells that could make things interesting. You want to avoid areas that have a lot of bait fish activity. If you go diving into the water and there's bait fish jumping everywhere, it's not only sharks that might be chasing these things, tarpon, cuda, all sorts of things that could cause you trouble. And of course, you want to be cautious in rough, murky water. And of course, that's one of the key factors that are affecting Florida. When you go north of Palm Beach County, as the Gulf Stream is farther offshore, we tend to have shallower seabeds, lots of smaller grain sands, lots of rough conditions, especially in the winter months, and that creates very murky conditions. We tend to also have a lot of fish migrating from one end of Florida to the other at that time of year. Shark populations will follow those bait fish, and so they're running in the same chaotic environment, accessing fish as prey items as surfers are using to surf. And that's where we get the majority of our bites. And they are usually just that. They're bites. They're mistaken identity, where the shark bites onto a leg or an arm or something like that, and it realizes it's bigger than what it thought it was. It's not what it was going after, and they let go. And then that person generally gets carted back to shore, and they get attention through the hospital, and they generally survived to live another day and tell the tale. It's very rare that a person actually dies from these types of bites. Now, I mentioned nurse sharks back in the previous slide with the pie chart of different sharks that are involved in shark attacks. And again, nurse sharks you wouldn't think would be a problem. However, people get themselves into trouble. They will often go down, and there's a story in Florida at least once or twice a year about this, where they will dive down, somebody will dive down, grab onto a nurse shark and start pulling its tail and lifting it up. Well, a nurse shark does not have a voice to yell and scream for you to go away. It doesn't have hands to push you. All it will do is turn head to tail, and it will bite. And nurse sharks, because they tend to eat a lot of mollusks, they like lobsters and conchs, and they suck meat out of things, they have a really good suction ability. That's where they get their name from. And they will suck onto that person and latch on. And a lot of times they will lock their jaw and they will not let go. And then the person has to take the nurse shark to the hospital with them, where the nurse shark has to get cut off. I don't think that's very fair for the nurse shark, which was laying on the bottom, minding its own business, not doing a darn thing to anybody. So, don't molest the sharks. Now, at the end of the day, sharks have far more to fear from us than we do of them. We kill thousands of sharks a year through overfishing and bycatch. Now, bycatch is when we're going after another target species, but we kill other things along the way. But we often target sharks, specifically for shark finning. Shark fin soup is a delicacy in the Asian markets, and we'll get into why that is in another time. But they literally fish just for those fins. It's a big industry in different parts of the world. And they'll catch sharks, they'll cut the fins off, they'll throw the carcasses back in the ocean. This is highly unproductive, and it is causing a lot of sharks to be endangered throughout the world. We also have a lot of pollution. not only chemicals and things that go into the water that cause what we call bioaccumulation, where they build up toxins in their systems, which is why it's actually not really great to eat shark meat, simply because they contain so many chemicals stored in their tissues. But also just fishing line and nets that are forgotten out there. Sharks will get caught in them and die. So sharks have a ton of things to worry about in terms of humans and what we do to the ocean. Not to mention the fact that because we're taking so many sharks out of the environment, it's totally imbalancing the entire system and causing a lot of problems ecologically. So I'm going to end on that note, and hopefully you've learned a little bit about why sharks are not quite as scary as they might seem. And just to close things out again, here is your in-depth question. So until next time, keep thinking.